Today we're going to be discussing sex research. In general, the research process, despite the discipline, is used to answer questions, and in this case, specifically to answer questions we as a society have about sex. But I wanted you to just first think of, what do you think might be some challenges unique to studying sexuality? What might be some reasons why it might be even more difficult to study sexuality? Now, some things that students have said in the past are sexuality tends to be an intensely private area of our lives, so it might be hard to get people to open up and share. Also, because of the type of society we have that many of you talked about in last week's discussion post, we're not used to talking about sexuality, so people might be embarrassed to disclose details about their own sexual attitudes or behaviors to another person because of guilt or shame, or just not being used to talking about it. So those are some of the inherently the difficulties that researchers have to overcome, some of them. So why study sexuality? Well, let's first of all just take a look at this cartoon where there's a researcher talking to a penguin, and the penguin says, "All we eat is fish. Fish has no fiber. We're all constipated. That's why we walk funny." And the point of this cartoon is that when we leave it up to people, or apparently penguins, to come to conclusions, often we base it just on our own experiences. So what we've come into contact with, whether that's through the media, through peers, through our family of origin, through our different structures we're exposed to, like religious or schools. So really the point of research is to move beyond information that's derived from our own personal beliefs, values, opinions, ideas, and personal experiences. And really the goal is to try to discover what the scientific truth is. Now, if that feels a little bit abstract, let's look at a real world example of some research. So there's a survey that's done every 2 years in the United States since 1991 of American youth. It's called the Youth Risk Behavior Surveillance System. I know it's kind of an ominous term, but basically it's a survey that asks all kinds of health behaviors of students. So everything from how much sleep they're getting to what type of foods they're eating. And one of the sections does include information about sexual activity. So one of the questions that's asked is about sexual intercourse. Now, hopefully you know that sexual intercourse is, certainly doesn't cover all types of sex that adolescents may have. Sexual intercourse specifically means vaginal penetration of a penis, but it's one type of sex that high school students may have. So again, this survey is done every 2 years, and the last year that it was conducted was last year in 2019. The results aren't available yet for that year. So let's look at 2017. So I want you to ask yourself a couple questions, and I want you to actually jot down an answer for these. So have a pencil and paper ready. So based on YRBS data that was collected, again, from students anonymously across the country, there are thousands of students that provide this information. I want you to ask yourself question number 1. So in 2017, what percentage of high school students, that's 9th through 12th grade, do you think said they had ever had sexual intercourse? And I'm going to give you a minute to think about that and jot something down. Okay, I'm not going to give you a full minute. That's a lot of silence. But hopefully you have some kind of percentage written down of just an estimate. I don't expect you to know this, but, what do you approximately think in terms of high school students who said they'd ever had sexual intercourse? And then the second question I want you to ponder before I give you the results is, do you think this percentage has increased or decreased since 1991 when they started this survey? Okay, so whatever percentage that you wrote down, do you think that that number is higher or lower? Do you think this percentage has increased or decreased since 1991? Okay, do you have both answers written down? Let's see what the results are. So this is a summary, again, of just some of the WIRE-BS data that was collected in 2017. And you can see that this summary actually includes the question that I asked you, the first one on the top there, of high school students that said that they had ever had sexual intercourse. And you can see that, hopefully you can see that in 1991, it was 54.1%. In 2017, it was 39.5%. And if you look at the numbers, you can see that actually it has slowly been decreasing. So look at what you wrote down. Were you right? Were you close? Were you way off? Usually what I find, this is really fun to do in class, is I find that students are all over the map. So most students actually think it's much higher. And so they'll, say things like, I think 80% of high school students said that they've ever had sexual intercourse, or 60%. Many students guess much higher than this actual number. The other thing that I find in terms of trends is that many students will think that this number has constantly been going up. So there's some kind of interesting phenomenon that happens that we tend to think with youth that things are always getting worse. And when I say worse, I'm putting that in quotes because I don't actually think there's anything wrong if people are ready to have sexual intercourse. But we have this idea that more and more students are having sex and that the numbers are much higher than they actually are. So just interesting to note. And my point, again, of giving you this example is to go back to the idea that we come up with these guesses based on our own experiences, our own belief systems, and a lot nowadays is also influenced by the media. We see a lot about youth being sexually active and somehow think that the numbers are much higher than students actually report. Now, one question that always comes up in class is students say, well, how accurate is this information? And that's a great question to ask. One of the things that researchers are constantly having to deal with is bias. So you can imagine that when a survey like this is conducted, even if researchers are collecting the information anonymously, even though they're having people come in that aren't their teachers, for instance, and are taking the surveys so students don't think that it's getting handed over to teachers or administrators. Even so, we know that some students may not tell the truth. And of course, what we're trying to do with research is get to the truth. So this is a huge area that researchers have to work on when they're selecting their methods, when they're deciding their strategies for how they're going to collect the data, what they share with participants in terms of making them feel more comfortable or not in terms of sharing their information. All of that is incredibly important in order to decrease bias. Now, I will tell you with the WIRE-BS, some students obviously don't tell the truth for various reasons. But what researchers feel like happens when it comes to this study is that when it comes to sexual activity, some students may actually embellish their experience. So they may say they've had sexual intercourse for whatever reason, even if they haven't. And some students may actually say that they have not, so that it balances itself out. The other thing to note in terms of the research, if I go back to that slide, is that regardless if there's some error, when we're looking at something like trends over time, we assume that that error would be in place. So it's still really significant to look at how much this continues to go down, even knowing that within each of those years, there might be some bias in terms of students telling the truth or not. And I really do want you to note when you're reading chapter 2, the different types of bias that are mentioned. The type of bias I just talked about is referred to as self-report bias. That's when participants might be, for whatever reason, might be lying about some information about themselves. Sometimes, though, it's not so blatant. They may forget, or they may just have a different perception of reality. So they may think even something like sexual intercourse means something different than it does when they're answering the question. So self-report bias is definitely something that researchers have to contend with and work hard to decrease. The other types of bias I want you to pay attention to in your reading that are significant when it comes to sexuality research are self-selection bias. That means, who's going to volunteer for these studies? It might be people that are more open about talking about their sexuality. They may be people who feel more comfortable. Unfortunately, what that does then is it removes other people that we also want to hear from. Another type of bias that is common is demographic bias. So certain segments of the population may be overrepresented. This is really important when we look at historical studies where people were very much excluded from research. So certain groups historically have been excluded. People of color, people who are female or non-binary, people who are not heterosexual. So that's one thing to pay attention to when you're looking at research, who's being included here, and maybe more importantly, who's being left out. And then the last type of research I want you to pay attention to during this module is reactivity. Basically, that means, are people changing their behavior when they're being observed? So this becomes especially important when you are learning about direct observation research, where people may be watched, for instance, and information recorded when they're being sexual, engaging in sexual activity. Would they change their behavior if they know that they're being watched?